Okay, is it working now? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. In here. Okay. Again, my thanks for staying. When you're the last speaker of the day, you wonder if anyone will be left, so I appreciate your being here. I want to make 3 apologies, too. The first of them is that if I had known one day I'd be addressing a group of educators, I would not have cut out of my Hebrew school so many times, and I would have learned Hebrew better. My apologies also for being an outsider. I don't know the country well enough, and what I do know is that it's 100 times more complex than most other countries. And 3, I want to apologize for wearing a tie. I'll try not to do that the rest of the week. I want to explain to you my views and the supporting data for those views, because the politicians and profiteers in my country, along with the so-called school reformers, may well destroy public education in my country, even while they say they are trying to fix it. And if they hurt public education, they may well destroy American democracy as we currently know it. And as you Israelis know better than I, democracy is a very fragile political system. In education, there's currently a germ spreading, G-E-R-M, germ. It is the Global Education Reform Movement, germ. And it's based on the assumptions that teachers are no good or public schools are not good, but it's hardly ever based on the assumption that unhealthy societies often have poor performing schools. My approach to understanding how a school or certain groups of students are doing is epidemiological rather than psychological, even though I'm trained as an experimental psychologist. The epidemiologist's creed is given in a story, and it's a very important one for what I'm going to present today. The story is 2 physicians are walking beside a river, and suddenly somebody comes down the river splashing and yelling, "Help, help, I can't swim." And the physicians jump into the river and pull the person out, administer artificial respiration. The person says, "Thank you," and walks away, and the physicians continue their walk. And a moment or 2 later, 2 people come down, floating down the river, yelling, "I can't swim, I can't swim." And they're flapping, and the physicians run in. They each take one and bring them back up, do artificial respiration, and everyone goes on their way. And sure enough, a minute or 2 later, 3 people come down the river, yelling, "I can't swim." They're flapping in the water. The physicians run in and with struggle bring the 3 up. And one of the physicians starts administering artificial respiration, and the other runs away. And the first physician says, "Stay here, I need your help." And the other one says, "Not now, I need to find out why they're falling in." Okay? That's the epidemiological approach. Why are some people failing in our schools? Why are some schools failing? Do you want to deal with the symptoms and do respiration? Or do you want to take at least some of your resources, one of the physicians, and go upstream and find out why they're falling in? That's kind of the approach I will present. I want to look at the causes of poor school performance, and I don't want to just think about the outcomes that occur. Whether you spend your time looking at the outcomes or causes of a problem makes a big difference in what you think and how you act. Each approach is a different frame for the very real education problems that do exist. Policy arguments in my country too often deal with a very simple dichotomy: treatment of symptoms versus elimination of educational problems. Much too simple a dichotomy, but people on both sides of that. Let's talk about framing the educational debate. Frames are mental structures that shape the way we see the world. When you hear a word, its frame is activated in your brain. It's from George Lakoff. He noted that the frames we use to make sense of our world determine a good deal about the way we conceptualize a problem, and thus how we think about it and how we judge potential solutions to the problem. In the USA, the achievements of our school may be one of those where the frame was switched on the citizenry while no one was looking. The trend I'm going to show you goes back to a time just after the great convergence of income in my country occurred, to around the time when the great divergence in income inequality occurred in my country, and when the rich swallowed up almost all the wealth that America generated. At the time, these influential folks managed to switch America from worrying about the characteristics of the children who entered our schools to worrying about the products that came out of our schools. Children, as children, were not so important. It was the product of the schools that mattered. Roughly 20 years ago, this switch started taking place. A kind of commodification of the educational process took place. Let me show you some evidence of this, because it's a very important one, and you may need to think about it here also. When we talk about framing the debate, we can look at the term achievement gap. Achievement gap are the scores at the end of schooling, 3rd grade, 5th grade, end of 10th grade, entrance to college, your national tests. We can look at the achievement gap between, let's say, wealthy and poor kids, white and black kids, Hispanic and Anglo kids. The achievement gap is what becomes important. It's an outcome measure. We can go to the New York Times, which is our newspaper of record. And in 1981 to 1990, there were 4 articles through that whole decade about the achievement gap. From 91 to 98, there were 14 articles about the achievement gap. From 99 to 2000, in 1 year, there were 59 articles. 2001 to 2006, during the George Bush administration, 217 articles. In 2007 alone, 35 articles. The term achievement gap rose to the top of how we talk about schools. Whatever happened to something else we used to talk about? Whatever happened to equal educational opportunity? Again, the New York Times. In 81 to 90, 86 articles on equal educational opportunity. 91 to 98, 66 articles. 91 to 2004 articles. 2001 to 6, 12 articles. 2007, 3 articles. So we see that the term achievement gap became dominant and the term equal educational opportunity falls by the wayside. Each is a frame for thinking about schooling in my society. Each provides a way for the narrative we tell about schools to be told. Now think of this. Equal educational opportunity is a frame for thinking about and worrying about and concern about the inputs to our schools. It requires concern about who comes into the education system. On the other hand, the achievement gap is about outputs, what it is that leaves the system. These are 2 incredibly different views, different frames of looking at education. If inputs matter, then family and jobs and income and neighborhood and preschool and healthcare and discrimination and racism and neighborhood efficacy and family violence are among the things that are important to worry about, because they will be affecting what kids bring with them when they enter our schools. If outputs matter, then those closest to the outputs receive the most scrutiny. Our teachers and administrators, who will get the blame and credit for the outputs. The other variables affecting school achievement are exogenous variables. They're not in the system. They're unaccounted for, and yet we know they are powerful influences on the school performance of children. Here's the New York Times graph on the 2 mentions of equal educational opportunity or the achievement gap. You can see that one goes down, the other goes up. Here's the Los Angeles Times during that same time period. One goes up, one goes down. We're losing equal educational opportunity, we gain in achievement gap. Here's the Boston Globe. Here's the Chicago Tribune. Here's the weekly magazine of record, Education Week. Again, huge difference. Here's the Washington Post. They never cared a damn for equal educational opportunity, and they really got on to the achievement gap. This is, this tells a little bit of the story. Here's more of it. This is the White House website from 2001 to 2007. The achievement gap, 344 documents out of the White House on their website. Here's equal educational opportunity, 3 documents. The Bush administration cared not at all about the kids coming in and what their lives were like. They cared about the outcomes. Now, that's not irrelevant. Outcomes are important. Everyone in here cares about outcomes. The problem is, which do you care about more or which do you care about equally? We moved our whole country to a different way of looking at the schools. The achievement gap frame versus the equal educational opportunity frame was a paradigm shift. It was a political shift. It was a focus on outputs, on short-term measurable results. The pressure was applied to schools and to kids, no child left behind, etc. We forget about inputs, adequate educational resources, preschools, professional development, effective pedagogies, opportunity to learn. So the USA and Great Britain at the same time chose to close the gap by using tests. That was their way of dealing with the gap. The theory of action behind these policies on both sides of the Atlantic was that we have lots of bad and lazy teachers and lots of kids sloughing off and having too much fun when they should be working. So let's bang both groups around a little and put a fire under their behinds and we'll get achievement up. Thus we got No Child Left Behind, you know, a high stakes testing program to get everybody motivated. Its follow-up with Obama called Race to the Top is really more of the same. There is now general consensus on both sides of the Atlantic that assessment policies to promote reduction in the achievement gap and to increase overall achievement has failed. For example, we now know that in the USA, the gains before No Child Left Behind on our NAEP tests, our national assessments, actually seemed greater before they put in No Child Left Behind than after. The curve was a slight growth before, the curve was down a little after. That is, the pressure wasn't working. The same thing in England with their tests also. We also know that curriculum, especially for poor kids, has been drastically narrowed by our tests, and that test prep dominates the curriculum in most schools that serve the middle and lower classes. We also know that dropout rates have increased as a function of high-stakes testing. Something else worth noticing is that by focusing on the achievement gap, the outcomes, rather than the inputs, the people closest to the gap are bound to get the blame. Let me use an example here. If a drunk driver hits a pedestrian, the driver is rightfully blamed for the accident. But what blame goes to the driver's companions who sat with the driver and let him or her drink and drive? What blame goes to the bartenders and the wait staff of the restaurant that served the drinks and knew that the driver was impaired? Do any moderating circumstances, such as the loss of a job or a divorce, change the culpability of the driver? My point is that in a just and more complex world, more than the driver would be blamed. But the law says the driver hit the person, the driver's to blame. And we understand that. When you shift to the achievement gap, then the people closest to it get all the blame. Okay? That's the teachers and administrators, the schools. Okay? We don't go back in time and say, did the kids have adequate preparation? Did they get good parenting? Was there preschool, etc.? Okay? So you got a real problem when you look at outcomes about who you blame for problems. The Bush administration, with Democrats on board, basically said blame everyone but society as a whole for the conditions under which some families and children must live. Let's blame those lousy and lazy teachers. If we just shape them up, things will get better. The reformers know precisely who the culprits are for the outcomes of schooling for poor and minority American kids, and they got us all to just forget about our mutual responsibility for the inputs. Worse, they say things like, poverty is no excuse. And I kind of agree, poverty is not an excuse, but it's a darn good explanation for a lot of what goes on in the schools. And it can't be ignored in either of our countries. Here's what I believe. I believe that vast inequalities in income in the US is our greatest school problem, and you simply cannot test your way out of that. I believe that Bush was wrong, that Obama is wrong, that Democrats and Republicans are wrong. Just want you to know I can't stand anybody equally. They're all wrong, and they're all too stuck with their beliefs to see how wrong they really are. They would rather have some one person or group to blame, to scapegoat, like unions or teachers or a minority group or a culture, than look in the mirror and say, we are all to blame. Diagnosis and prescription are not in sync. If you get the diagnosis right, that there are some schools that are indeed failing, but your prescription to remedy that ailment is wrong, you can't cure the ailment, ever. And you may kill the patient because you were unable to prescribe the right drugs. Most politicians believe that teachers, next to parents, who are really the first of the child's teachers, make the biggest difference in the lives of kids. And I think they may be right, while the child is in school. But all those wrong-headed people have not understood one simple fact that stands out and should make them see the fault of their logic, but never does. Kids are not in school for most of their lives. They are mostly with family and in neighborhoods, And too many of those families and neighborhoods are toxic physically and psychologically. Let me show you what I mean by this. How many hours of work awake per year is a kid? 16. How many days are there in a year? 365. Leaves about 5,840 hours to account for. 1,150 of those hours are spent in school, and about 4,690, 4,700, let's round it to 5,000 hours are spent in neighborhood and family. Now, if you had to bet $10 on the power of affecting a child, their motivation, their resilience, their this and that, where would you put your $10? On the 5,000 hours or the 1,000 hours? I mean, the power is really outside of school, not inside of school. And we do miracles. I'm so proud of what we do with 1,000 hours, okay, as an educator. But you have to understand the power is in family and in neighborhood. That's a ratio of 5 to 1, but let me give you a thought experiment here. Let me ask you all to say to yourself, from birth to age 18, what percentage of a child's life is spent in a schoolroom, or in a school, in a classroom, in a school? If you work that out for yourself, I don't know quite the hours, I looked it up, it'll come out to approximately 10% of the time between birth and 18 that a child is in a school. That's a 9 to 1 ratio. Okay? Now, some of that the child is sleeping, and you just put in universal preschool, I understand. Congratulations. That'll mean more time in the school. But it'll come out to about 10%. That's not a lot. Where is the money to be placed on what's going to influence the lives of children? Would you bet on family and neighborhood or on school? We educators do a damn good job with the hours that we have. Miracles happen. Teachers in schools do great things. But when my current or the last president says that teachers are the most important factor in producing academic achievement, they are simply full of baloney. It is not true. And their mistake results in policies that cannot be made to work. Please remember, if the opening premise of an argument is wrong, say that teachers or schools or administrators are the cause of so many kids not learning, then all the policies that follow are going to be wrong as well. The diagnosis is okay, problem exists, certain kids are not learning, but the methods chosen to fix those things will not work. With these set of facts in mind, we easily see that test-based accountability policies in my country make a huge error in inference. By the emphasis on testing, they held teachers in schools responsible for learning, which, by the way, is a logical impossibility. Learning is a student's job, not a teacher's job. Test-based accountability removes much of the responsibility from students and their families for the student's academic performance. Test-based schemes neglect to acknowledge that students and families share in the responsibility for academic performance. Learning is constructed by a learner. Stuff is just not poured into them in the school. And they often have to want to learn. And that's where parents, guardians, neighbors, communities, churches, synagogues, and so forth all come in. This notion that the teacher in my country is responsible for student learning is a very difficult one. Many of you are university professors like me. None of us take responsibility for student learning. We go, we lecture, we assign them books, and we say, go learn, okay? It's your responsibility, okay? All of a sudden, if you go back a year before, when these kids are in high school in my country, the teacher is responsible for learning. 1 year later, they're not. Something's odd here. Teaching and learning have a relationship, but one is not the cause of the other. Let me give you a good example of this, because it's very important. We're holding teachers responsible for learning, but here's a good example that I found. Yesterday, I taught my dog to whistle. The stupid dog did not learn. Was I teaching? Okay. So you see, selling and buying. I can be a salesman for a week or 2 or 3. And if nobody buys, I was still a salesman. I may not have been a good one, but I was still a salesman, okay? There's dependencies here, as my philosopher, where's Jonathan? Jonathan knows these arguments. You know these arguments. we are holding the teachers responsible for student learning. And there is some relationship, but responsibility goes a little too far. Particularly when you know this. If you ask what partialing the variance of achievement out, what part is attributable to family and neighborhood, the answer is almost always 60%. And if you ask what part is attributed to schooling, the answer is almost always around 20%. And about 20% of that variance is unaccounted for. That's an average over lots of different studies. But here's the thing. People say, well, 20% of the variance is good to affect the kids. That's good. Yes, it is. But that's 20% of the variance by schooling. And teachers are only a small part of schooling. Curriculum's a part of schooling. Technology's a part of schooling. Peer group and compositional effects are a part of schooling, etc. So teachers' power is limited, not at the individual level. This is a key point. Every one of us could probably tell a story about a teacher that affected our lives. I certainly can. I have kids that can. I have grandchildren that can. A teacher's powerful effect on an individual is different from a teacher's effect on group outcomes, which are much more moderated by context, neighborhood, peer group, etc. So we're trying to do too much with these tests. So 3-to-1 variation here in the power of outside the school factors compared to inside the school factors. Now certainly people overcome their group membership, whatever it is. Rich kids fail. They don't get into Harvard. Poor kids do get into Harvard. Demography is not destiny. Okay? But at the same time that we say demography is not destiny, in the United States, only 9% of the students in the lowest quartile of the social class distribution are graduating from college. Only 9% of the bottom 25% in income. Meaning that once you're born into the lower social classes, you're likely to be there the rest of your lives. That's not the way my country sees itself. It sees itself as the great land of opportunity. You can be anything you want to be in the United States, but there's some limits on that, it turns out. We don't like to think of it. Individuals do defy the odds. There are rags to riches stories, often proving that hard work and dedication can overcome adversity. That's terrific to learn, but that does not mean you can make policy on this basis. What we have in my country right now is people pointing out all the success stories, and we got lots of them. We got lots of people in the United States. There's always a woman or man who rises to the top. Bill Gates, well, he came from an actually wealthy family, but there are others, and they're always pointing to them. You can't make policy on the basis of exceptions. You make policy on the basis of generalizations. Let me give one clear example. I can go anywhere within my university, I don't know about here, but somewhere within 2 or 3 miles of my university, I can find some 90-year-old that is smoking a pack of cigarettes a day and drinking half a bottle of Jim Beam bourbon. Okay? Now what do? Take the warning labels off cigarettes and tell people, oh, keep drinking, it's good for you. No. If you drink that amount of bourbon every day, and if you smoke that much every day, you're going to die young. Okay, that's the rule we have. So we do public policy. The fact that exceptions abound doesn't mean anything. But in education, every time some poor kid succeeds, they say, see, poverty's not an excuse. Well, it's not an excuse, but poverty is a really damn good explanation for why lots of other kids are not achieving well. So that's all background to what I'm trying to say. Our presidents, our secretaries of education keep generalizing from the exceptions when they say that teachers are the most important factor in a student's success. Let's look at poverty and inequality now, but first a little background on some things that are going on in my country, maybe in yours. It seems to be part of Europe as well. How much richer are the richest 20% and the poorest 20%? If you look at this chart provided by Wilkinson and Pickett, you see that the richest, except for Singapore, which is an anomaly, the richest 20% in the USA make about 8.5 times more than the bottom 20%, a gap double that of Japan or Finland or Norway and a few other countries, including Denmark, which is recognized as the happiest country on earth. Now, Denmark pays a lot of taxes. I've spent time there. Denmark bitches about their taxes just the way Israelis do and Americans do. But they pay a lot of money in taxes, as I'll show you, and they're the happiest country on earth. They have a low gap between the richest and the poorest. And it's an important part of their culture, and they're very proud of it, as does Finland and Norway and Nordic countries. On the other hand, the USA is down at the bottom. The income gap in 2009 was the highest of the richer nations. Now you'll notice there something interesting. Singapore, USA, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, all have something in common. They're down at the bottom. They are big gaps in income between the richest and the poorest. And what they all had was some version of a British system of capitalism. When the Brits get anywhere, we get an exploitive capitalist system. Okay? The only exception to that rule on that graph is Canada, and that's because the French got there first. Okay? What? Portugal was not a British system, was it? No. No, it's not the only explanation. But where the Brits went, child labor laws were terrible. Dickens lives everywhere that the Brits went. Okay? Now, some of my best friends are British, but I say that to them and they agree with me too. Okay. We weren't so bad 30 years ago, but the rich have so influenced legislation and tax codes that they now own more than at any time since the 1920s, since just before the Great Depression. We can think of two kinds of capitalism in the world, and one might be called laissez-faire capitalism, and the Brits are famous for that, and we have adopted their system. And the other kind of capitalism might be called bridled or enlightened capitalism, and that's what the Northern Europeans seem to do. And I don't know how to judge your economy. At times you look a little bit like the Northern Europeans to me, and at times you look more like... Yeah, you're closer. Yeah, you're closer. But you also have in place now universal preschool. You also have in place a medical system that's different. So, you know, it's a hybrid to me as an outsider. Anyway, in the USA, we have a very British heritage, and the Northern Europeans have enlightened or bridled capitalism. Their societies do look different. Now, here's how this change in the USA has played out, and I give it as a warning to you. Between 1948 and 1979, incomes grew in the USA by dramatic amounts in real dollars. On the left, you see that the vast majority of US citizens, 90% of them, shared in real growth in income. The rich got richer, a lot richer than they were, but not obscenely so. That's not so bad, since their riches might well have been deserved for their innovations and hard work. They were also taxed at rates double what they are today. So they were required through the tax system we had to return some of their wealth to the commons, to all the Americans. Even with these higher tax rates, we had a period of unprecedented growth, and all Americans prospered. Right around then, the great convergence of incomes in the USA stopped, and the great divergence began. The rich had about 10% of all my nation's income flowing to them in 1979, well down from what they had in 1928. When just before the Great Depression, they had almost 25% of all the income generated in the USA. Look at the right now, more recently, just before the recent market collapse, roughly 2000 to 2007, on the right side. Average American income did not grow much at all, and the bottom 90% of Americans lost income, while the top 1% and their close friends, those in the top 10%, received all the income growth that occurred. All. Let me say it again. All. All the growth during the Bush years, and that has continued as well under Obama. Almost all the growth went to the top 10%, and this was despite the fact that huge gains in productivity were occurring, which used to be shared with workers. But that stopped too about 20 or 30 years ago. Now, just as in 1928, the rich in America get about 1/4 of all my nation's income. And that's unsustainable, and it's why an Occupy Wall Street movement has developed, and I understand you have something similar here in Israel. According to the 2010 census figures, the median annual income for a male full-time year-round worker in 2010 was $1,300 less in 2010 dollars than was earned in 1973. In other words, the middle class is losing ground. If you're losing ground, your kids are affected. because your income's affected. You can't get the kids the toys, the games. You can't go to the movies. You can't take the vacations. You don't go to the museums. You don't go on vacations. You know, lots of things happen. You have to move out of one neighborhood and into another one. Lots of things happen when you're not rising and you don't have that future perspective. Despite their complaints, the individuals and families in the top 10% actually have paid the lowest tax rate since World War II to support the nation that gives them that wealth, and that's why we're having trouble supporting our schools in the U.S. These are 2009 taxes as a percent of gross domestic product. And the first thing to notice is down at the bottom that the USA, despite all the complaints in the USA, among the rich nations of the world, it doesn't pay high taxes at all as a percent of gross domestic product, putting all the taxes in. And despite all the grumbling I always hear from my friends in Israel, you're in the middle of the pack. Okay? You're not the worst in that. You look up at the top, you see Denmark, Sweden, Belgium, Finland, Norway. They pay a lot in taxes, and they're willing to. They get a lot back. Let's look a little bit at corporate taxes, because that's where you actually look better. Israel's a little on the high middle side here in what they tax their corporations. But you will notice at the bottom that the USA is once again among the lowest taxed nations in the world. You can't support the commons. You can't support the army. You can't support the preschools. You can't support the roads. You can't support lots of things, that medical health, if people aren't paying into the system. You just can't do it, okay? And so the United States has managed over 20 or 30 years to concentrate wealth in one group and take away the tax base from almost everybody. You can't sustain good education systems that way. Public education now costs a fortune at the college level, even in the state schools, okay? California state schools, not the UC system, California state schools, 17, 18 campuses are now about $12,000, and the UCs are more like 18 or 20. Those were free schools when I went to them, when I started my bachelor's degree. This is hard to imagine. I said the corporations aren't paying in, and you need to understand, because you have to watch that here. This is stuff that spreads. If a corporation gets a tax break over there, they tell the Israeli government, we're going to move the industry out of here if we don't get a tax break here. So there's a game being played, and if those games get played, the money comes out of the commons, which we all depend on in education. Here's what's happened in my country as this game gets played. Here's profits for the 3 years, 2008 to 2010. 2008, 2009, 2010. There's the profits. General Electric made $10,460 million in profits. Verizon made $32 billion in profits. Boeing, $9 billion. Wells Fargo, $49 billion. Honeywell International, $4 billion. Now, let's ask what these companies paid in taxes. Well, General Electric paid 0 taxes and got rebates totaling $4 billion. Verizon paid 0 taxes and got rebates totaling a mere $951 million. Boeing, 0 taxes, $178 million back. Wells Fargo, 0 taxes, $681 million back. Honeywell, 0 taxes, $34 million back. This is the game they're playing, and they'll play it here too. They're already playing it in Europe. You know, we'll pull it out and go to India. We'll pull it out and go to Russia, low tax rates. They're quite willing to put their money someplace else. And if the money goes someplace else, the commons can't be supported. And if the commons can't be supported, we have problems with our schools. What happens when we have vast inequalities in wealth? Well, here we go to Wilkinson and Pickett again, and now we're into closer to the meaning of my topic and what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about. Over on the ordinate is an index of health and social problems made up of life expectancy, math and literacy scores from Pisa, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage birth, all the things that you judge a society on. That's over on the ordinate. On the abscissa is the Gini coefficients that they use to judge a society on income inequality. You will notice a very strong relationship between lousy social conditions and income inequality. The USA, as you may know, we like to be number one, and we are. We're number one in having the highest level of inequality among any industrialized nation and the worst social system of any of them. We are over there in the right-hand corner, way up by ourselves. Yay, team. We're number one. We're number one. Let me be clear about this. In the studies that were done, it's not gross domestic product per person we're talking about. It's how the income is divided up. It has to do with inequality in a society, regardless of what they're bringing in. Okay? So it's an inequality issue we're talking about, not gross domestic product. Otherwise, Luxembourg would be the highest nation in the world if it was just gross domestic product per person. So it's not money that determines this, it's inequality. The relationship for us in the US holds for all our states. There's the relationship for our states, not quite as tight a line because of the way these were computed, but nevertheless, you all know how to read a regression line. There's a strong relationship, and as you'd expect, some of our states like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama are disasters, high inequality, and worse social conditions. What does that look like for children? Here's child well-being, and it's better in more equal rich countries than in less equal rich countries. There's the USA. It's going to anchor the back there. Israel's not doing real well in child well-being. It has not too bad inequality, but it's well below the regression line. Now, in my country, we have politicians. You have an election coming in 2 days, I gather, and I'm sure all the candidates are saying they love children. In my country, they run around kissing babies and telling everyone how much they love children. And it turns out we love children in my countries as much as, I should say, we love children less well than every other industrialized nation. I mean, these are child well-being indices, and we're the worst. So while we pride ourselves in loving our children, we don't take very good care of them. We cannot hide. We have to deal with facts that inequality is hurting us. 1 in 6 people in the USA are now poor, according to the latest census data, compared to 1 in 10 in 2004. That's a big shift. And it's got to have effects on our schools. Between 2000 and 2010, the number of suburban households below poverty increased by 53%, compared to a 23% increase in poor households in urban areas. This is the first time ever that suburban poverty exceeded urban poverty in our country. Last year, there were 2.7 million more suburban households below the federal poverty level than urban households, first time on record. According to the Brookings Institute, 1 year ago, about 6.5 million children under the age of 18 are living in families with an unemployed adult. More than 1 million of these children live in California, which has an unemployment rate well over 10%. Of particular concern is the number of children living with parents who have been out of work for more than 6 months. This number totals 3 million nationally. Children in California, Florida, Michigan, Nevada are particularly likely to be living with parents who have been out of work 6 months or longer. We have data from Sweden that when people lose their jobs, their health deteriorates, they commit suicide more often, they drink more often. Males in particular, women bond differently and find other ways to cope with it. But males, if they lose their jobs, go to pieces and it hurts their families. Okay? And you know the story of Russia when everything went to hell. Men were drinking themselves to death. That's just happened in Sweden with the last problems they had with the recession about 10 years ago. The health statistics are now out and men were dying at very high rates. They don't cope well with it, and that means their families don't cope well with it. If families aren't coping well, schools will show that as well. In fact, child poverty has risen by a percentage point or more for each of the last 4 years, as you'd expect in the recession. We went from 18% for child poverty in 2007 to 22% in 2010, and may only be a point better right now in 2012. The number of poor children has increased by 3 million over the recession's time period. There's been a rise in homeless children in most states as the recession takes its toll. Well, you get the picture. We have lots of homeless families now, and we didn't used to have them in suburbia. We have them in suburbia as well as in the inner cities. Here's the prevalence of mental illness, which is higher in more unequal countries. Israel's not on this one, as I recall. If they didn't have trustworthy data, they left countries out of some of these things. So this is the prevalence of mental illness, and it's higher in more unequal countries. There's the USA over on the right again, high income inequality, highest percentage of mental illness. Now, the reason this is important for educators is that in the USA, there's a general prevalence of serious mental illness of about 4%. That's what you can expect. But that rate is higher in low-income neighborhoods and lower in high-income neighborhoods. So in upper-income neighborhoods, the rate's about 2 or 3%. In lower-class neighborhoods, 6 to 9%, roughly 8% on average, are mentally ill. Now, why is this important for a school? You're a school principal of a school with 300 kids in an upper-income neighborhood. That's going to give you a 2% rate. You're going to have six families that are mentally ill, and they will drive you and you as a principal and you as the teachers all crazy, just like they are. Okay, these are kids that are troubled. These are families that are troubled. But you got 6 of them. You're in an inner city school with 500 kids at an 8% rate. You got 40 families that are going to require that kind of service. If you give both schools the same amount of money, the school with more mentally ill people will have to use more resources to cope with that, and they can't therefore deal with science and math and everything else because they just don't have the resources. So mental illness affects our schooling. And the big question out there was, does poverty make you mentally ill, or does being mentally ill make you poor? And the research says both. Research says both are the causes. If you're poor, if you're mentally ill, you tend to drift into poor neighborhoods because you have trouble holding jobs. But if you are in a poor neighborhood, you tend to show mental illness signs because life is very difficult for you. So there's a harder burden on our schools under those conditions. Drug use is more common in more unequal countries. Again, that inequality is hurting countries badly. Schooling is hard to do in environments where parental and childhood drug use is high, and it is higher in more unequal societies than more equal societies. And when drug sales become the economic system promising the most rewards, as is true in some rural and urban neighborhoods in the USA, where methamphetamine and marijuana are the basis for the local economy, there's a hollow sound to the school's promise of a better future through hard work. It makes educating much harder. Here, Israel surprised me, since you present average levels of drug use with the most controlled borders in the world. But inequality yields poverty, and poverty is related to drug use, and you have both inequality and poverty rates above the, let's say, the Nordic countries. So you have a drug problem too, it looks like, and it may not be as bad as ours, but according to a lot of UNESCO data, it's related to income inequality. Infant mortality rates are higher in more unequal countries. You can see it there. You actually do pretty well on that. Here's the US rate, just so you know. Singapore is at 2 infants die per 1,000 births in Singapore, but in the US it's 6.5. Isn't that tragic? And if you look at black Mississippians, it's 17. Okay? Guess who's not doing well in school? Black Mississippi families. Mississippi in general. Inequality has side effects, and among them are these. Now, one of the reasons this is important, like I say, you're not on this list, but you're down around 2. I looked it up. So you're among the leaders of the world in reductions in infant mortality. You were in 1973 in Israel, where we are now. We're supposed to be a great nation. Not so great when you look at it a little closer. And the reason for this not greatness, I put it to income inequality more than anything else. The reason this is important, is that infant mortality is highly correlated with low birth weight babies. Low birth weight babies always have bleeding problems, okay? That means they could be minor, they could be major, but 5 years after low birth weight babies are born, they show up in school, and the school has problems with them. So the worse your healthcare system, the more likely schools are going to have problems, the more likely it's going to cost money to take care of these kids. It goes, this just goes on and on with inequality. More children drop out of high school in more unequal US states. It almost looks causal to me. From what I know, inequality leads to visions that you can't get out of the social class you're in. Why bother to stay in school? You're never going to go to college anyway. Social mobility is higher in more rich countries. We don't have much data on this, but it's pretty clear that in the USA, The correlation between the income of siblings is over 0.4, and the correlation among siblings in Nordic countries is around 0.2. Square those, and you get about 4% of the variance in adult income by siblings is related to their family life in the Nordic countries, and 16% of your income is related to your family in the US. In other words, we're a lot more likely to have your family determine your income than in the more Nordic countries. So the United States, which likes to think of itself as a meritocracy, has allowed this inequality to occur, and it's no longer the meritocracy it thought it was. Only 6% of the kids born into families in the lowest 20% of income, about $25,000 a year in my country, ever get to the top 20% in income, about $100,000. You're locked in. Here's something to think about. Your parents are now a greater determiner of your income in life in the USA than your weight or your height. Okay. That's a vicious, vicious fact of life. Okay, so you get that. Here is what I consider the most important graph of the decade. Over on the left is the standard deviation units between a typical kid in the 90th percentile family, relatively wealthy kid, and a typical kid in the 10th percentile family, a relatively poor kid. Not the extremes, but you know, a little. And the standard deviation difference between those two kinds of kids. In 1940, and this is a wonderful study done by John Reardon at Stanford. He went back to all the data sets he could find and got them all into a common metric. The standard deviation between the rich and poor kids in 1940 was about 0.6. Two curves that overlap. Richer kids did better than poorer kids, but they weren't pulled apart dramatically. Okay? A lot of poor kids were doing well in school, a lot of rich kids were not doing well in school. Move the curve up to the year 2000, 2004, where he had the last data, I think, and you see that the standard deviation units are 1.2, 1.2 approximately. In other words, the two curves that overlapped are now pulled apart. Okay? Wealthy kids score so high, and poor kids score so low in my country that they live in two completely different worlds and have two completely different ways of getting into college and in a knowledge society. This is really hard. Income inequality is really hurting us. Some others, teenage birth rates are higher in more unequal rich countries. There's the USA with the highest teenage rates. That's hard on mothers, hard on babies, hard on schools. I'm going to skip a few of these. Rates of imprisonment are higher in more unequal countries. We have the highest rate of prison per capita of any country, almost any country, certainly all the rich countries. Really remarkable. And most of those are nonviolent offenders, drug use, and that sort of thing. And we know how to stop that. Early childhood education, which you've now made universal, is a known predictor of reduction in prison rates, okay? At least in the US. Let's get into what this looks like in Pisa. There's the curve. The blue line is Finland. On the abscissa, again, is a index of social background, low social class, high social class. And the most important thing to notice here is the difference between Finland and some other countries. The steeper slope is a less equitable system. Canada, the US, and Germany are featured in this one. You can see the amazing loss of achievement on reading literacy in Germany and the United States because of these steeper gradients. Lower class kids in the United States and Germany are doing so much worse than lower class kids in Canada and Finland. Notice at the upper end, in all these countries, at the upper end there's hardly any difference at all. Among wealthy kids in all countries, Pisa scores look similar. Among poor kids, they look very different depending on the inequality in the country. The gap in order for Germany is about 3 years in schooling at the lower end. The gap is about a month or 2 or 3 at the upper end. Those are remarkable differences in outcomes of schooling having to do with class. Here's scores on the PISA for poor kids in Australia. The most important thing to notice is that, well, the table is set up about on the columns. You're seeing the social class that predominates at the school, okay, by a quintile. The lowest social class, next, highest social class by school are the columns. On the rows, you're seeing the family's social class, because families are separate from the mean for the school. So again, you see them in quintiles. The things to look at are, for example, for a middle-class kid in a middle-class school, the score in Australia was 512 on the Pisa, what is this, the reading or, I can't remember if this is reading or science. I think this was science. Okay, the score, did I say science there? Okay, good, science. The median kid, that 3-3 graph of 512, column of 512, that's the median kid in the median school, and the kid's doing a little above the international average. If you look at the lowest class kid in a school that serves the most lower class kids, that scores 455, way off the international average. And if you go to the opposite end, you see a score of 607. That's a kid from the highest families in a school that serves wealthy kids. That's a gap of about a standard deviation and a half, close to that graph I showed you from Sean Reardon. This gap is terrible. These are rural kids, these are indigenous kids, these are poor kids in one cell, these are the wealthy kids in the other. Those are amazing gaps. Here's the latest in, this is TIMSS that just came out. All I want to show you is the 2 left bars for the 4th grade and the 2 left bars for the 8th grade. Those 2 groups show kids who go to school where less than 10% of the kids in the school are in poverty, or kids that go to school where only 10 to 25% of the kids are in poverty, at 4th and 8th grade, outperformed most nations in the world. The United States outperformed them. Those are 15 million US kids. Go to the last bar there, and you see that our kids don't do as well. These are kids who are in schools with over 75% of the kids in poverty. In other words, if you're ghettoized, particularly, into schools that serve other poor kids, then the peer effect, the composition effects are going to affect your achievement too, dramatically. Here's the latest in the Pearls reading study. Exactly the same story. The 2 left bars, roughly 15 million American kids in those 2 groups, outscored everybody in the world. The ones over on the right did not. Here's the Pisa scores, which you all worry about here, I know. You'll find Israel down near the bottom in that 472 to 489 group, not doing real well. I broke out the US scores. I don't know if you can break out the Israeli scores. It makes a big difference to tell us what one of the problems is in education. USA schools with under 10% of their students in poverty scored 551, the highest score in the world. Go down a little, then there's Korea and Finland, and then US schools with under 25% of their students in poverty scored 3rd in the world. Okay? Now, these are 15 million kids. These are not 8 kids, okay? These are not private school kids, these are public school kids. Public school kids in nice neighborhoods, middle class and above, are getting terrific educations in the US. But start dropping down, and you see at the very bottom, US schools with over 75% of their students in poverty, and we have a lot of them, scored 446, awful, embarrassing, only above Mexico. Now the question for you Israelis, when you worry about your schools, is can you break out your data this way? And does it show the same thing? I'm going to guess yes. Hanan knows the scores. Okay, yeah, I'm going to guess yes. And it tells you that school is not failing. We're failing certain groups of kids. Okay? Many of these are the same teachers now teaching in the schools that serve the wealthy started in schools that serve the poor. They just moved up when they got it a little easier, when they got some seniority. Those teachers are not bad teachers, but they're teaching easier to teach kids. It makes a big difference. Here's the gist of this all. If we take a regression line, run it through the scores on Pisa, this is 2006 mathematics. just wealthy nations. Israel is in there, sort of in the middle, near the regression line, ISL. If you look at the scores, the USA is over on the right, lots of inequality and poor performance. Finland is way over at the top, one of the highest performing in that administration. And here's the point. In a regression equation, you can play with the variables. So if you insert in this regression equation the Finnish rate of childhood poverty and take out the US rate of childhood poverty, then the US goes well above the regression line and is scoring well above average. And if you insert the US rate of childhood poverty for the Finnish scores, they drop well below average, and they're no longer a world leader. Okay? Finland has about a 4% rate of childhood poverty. The US has about a 22% rate of childhood poverty. Flip them, and you get dramatic changes in the scores, at least on paper. But I'm going to argue in real life that would work the same way, too. Okay. I'm told I'm running out of time, and that's okay, because I think I've given you most of what I want to do. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. I hope that we can make public education better by designing policies so that we have a much broader middle class, like some of the Northern European countries, and a much smaller lower class. The distribution of wealth in both your country and mine and the segregation of certain groups is hurting both nations, I think. Reducing inequality is the best way I know to improve our schools. Less poverty results in kids being better cared for, more two-parent guidance in their lives, less family moves, lower rates of mental illness, higher birth weights, lower smoking rates, more learning in the summer, more home support for learning, and so forth. It really isn't ineffective teachers that's America's major educational problem, though that's what you'd get from reading the newspapers. Some bad teachers do exist, and they need to be gotten rid of. It's really broad-based inequality and poverty, the sequelae to broad-based inequality is a big chunk of people living in poverty. That's our real problem, and we can lick that by only one way, which is electing people that are willing to deal with the tax issues and the spending for the commons issues. To me, the best way to improve the US school is quite simple. If we want better schools for our kids, we need to vote into office people that understand the effects of inequality and poverty on achievement, and not the corporate candidates we now have who want to test our kids constantly so they can conclude what we have concluded since standardized testing was invented in China 1,000 years ago, namely that poor kids from poor families brought up in poor neighborhoods almost never do as well as wealthy kids from wealthy families brought up in wealthy neighborhoods. How many hundreds of years does it take politicians to understand this? Thank you for listening.